All right, listeners, ready to dive into some seriously heavy economic stuff. We're talking tax cuts, deficits, and whether those two can ever actually, get along. We've got our expert here to help us unpack this dense report about what happens if the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's the TCJA, gets a permanent extension. So buckle up, because this is big. We're talking trillions of dollars in impact that could last, generations.
Yeah, no, it really does. This report doesn't mess around. It goes deep into what making those 2017 tax cuts permanent would mean for, well, everything, really.
Okay, so, let's just start with, our wallets more money in them or less if the TCJA sticks around?
So short term, this report's saying most Americans, like the people alive right now, would probably see more money if the TCJA was permanent. Kind of like a, I don't know, little bonus from having lower taxes.
All right, well, that sounds pretty good, but, come on, it can't be that simple, can it? I mean, tax cuts mean the government has less money, right?
You'd be right to be a little suspicious there. The report estimates extending the TCJA. Yeah, that could add $4 trillion. That's a 4 with 12 zeros after it to the national debt over the next decade.
Okay, yeah, wow, that is a lot of zeros. So even if we're seeing extra cash now, sounds like maybe our kids or their kids are going to get stuck with the bill for it later.
That is the question this whole report's trying to figure out. It's saying, basically, this short-term gain could mean a really long-term burden for, anyone born from now on.
Okay, so how does that even work? How does more debt today mean future generations are, stuck paying for it?
Think of it like this. Imagine the national debt's this giant credit card we keep using. Those bills, they got to get paid eventually. And in this case, it might be our kids or their kids who have to do the paying, probably through higher taxes or cuts to, stuff they need.
So we're basically saying, hey, future, you owe us for this. We get lower taxes, but they might end up paying the interest on that, basically.
Pretty much. And the report actually tries to put a number on that burden. It says someone born 30 years from now, they could be worse off by almost $22,000 over their whole life just because of how much higher the debt would be from these tax cuts. And that number gets even bigger the further into the future you go.
$22,000 less? Over a lifetime? That's what, working an extra year or more just to make up for what we're spending now? Really makes you think about, what those tax breaks are really costing us,
It definitely shows how important it is to think about, the big picture, the long game with this kind of economic policy. Because something that seems good now can have consequences for a long time.
For sure. And it feels like there's more to it, too. It's not just the total amount of debt, but who ends up having to deal with it most, right?
You got it.
Yeah.
The report looks at how that debt increase might not hit everyone equally. Because of how the debt changes future taxes or what the government can spend money on, some groups might end up paying a lot more of it back than others.
So it's not even as simple as, well, the future will be richer, they can handle it. This could actually make things more unequal later on.
That's a big part of what this report's saying. Yeah, it's we got to look past just the dollar figures and think about how those dollars are actually going to be, spread around now and in the future.
Man, this is already making my head spin a little. Okay, so before we totally freak out, what about the arguments for making the TCJA permanent?
Right, so the report does say, even with these risks, there's a chance extending the tax cuts could make the economy grow faster.
Okay, so less taxes, more growth. Makes sense, but how does that actually supposed to work?
So they talk about these economic feedback effects. Basically, money you save from taxes. It doesn't just, disappear. It goes back into the economy somehow.
Okay, so, what does that actually look like?
Imagine you own a business, and suddenly your taxes are lower. Maybe you take that extra money and invest it back in, hire more people, buy new equipment, grow the business. That can mean higher wages for your employees, they spend more, and the whole economy gets a little boost. That's the feedback effect.
So it's each little bit kind of ripples outward. Those initial tax cuts could create this chain reaction that ends up, I don't know, making up for some of that lost government money.
Yeah, that's the idea. But whether it's enough to actually make up for that potential $4 trillion increase, that's definitely up for debate, and the report knows that.
Right, because it's a lot of potential and could and all that. It's not like cutting taxes just magically guarantees a boom.
Exactly. The report's very clear that trying to predict the economy is, well, messy. There are so many factors. Saying what'll happen that far out always has some guesswork.
So we've got possible good stuff now, possible bad stuff later, and a whole lot of we don't actually know for sure mixed in. What's really interesting to me, though, is this isn't just some, abstract econ stuff. This is about, fairness, responsibility, what we owe the future.
It really is.
Hmm.
Like, are we okay making things harder later so things can be easier now? And even if we are, is that fair to the people who'll be dealing with it but had no say in it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, totally. And this report, it actually gets into the specifics,
Yeah.
Like one thing it really focuses on is the child tax credit, which, let's be real, is super important for a lot of families, especially those who don't make as much.
Right, for sure. When that part of the TCJA went through, it was like a really big deal for a lot of people I knew. So what's the report say about making that permanent?
Well, it says that extending it could mean like a really noticeable difference in the amount of money lower income households have after taxes.
Mhm.
Basically more money for the folks who need it most.
Okay, so win-win for those families, right? Less to the government means more they can spend on like everyday stuff.
Right, exactly. But, and this is a big but, even with something like the child tax credit, which seems pretty straightforwardly good, you still can't ignore those long-term economic effects we were talking about.
Right, that whole $4 trillion thing kind of hangs over everything, huh? So how could that even impact something like this, the child tax credit, years later?
It's like, imagine down the road, the government's trying to deal with all that debt. They might have to make some tough calls, like raising taxes or cutting back on programs, including, yeah, the ones that help those families with kids.
So even if it's helping right now, later on, those same families could be hit even harder if the government has to, like, balance the books.
Exactly. It's kind of lose-lose situation potentially, right? And this report really lays that out there, how it's just not that simple. It makes you think about those unintended consequences, what happens way down the line.
For sure. It's like, we can't just look at the here and now. Gotta think 5, 10 years out. Okay, but enough about families for a sec. This report also talks about how the TCJA would affect, like, businesses, right? Especially with that whole dynamic scoring thing.
Right, right. So dynamic scoring, and I know that sounds kind of jargony, basically it just means trying to account for all those ripple effects we keep talking about.
Got it. So not just what happens right when taxes are lower, but how that change might make the whole economy shift around in the long run.
Exactly. Like, will it actually lead to more growth, more jobs, more investment, stuff that could actually end up bringing in more tax revenue down the road, even if the rates are lower?
So it's kind of a gamble then. Like, we're hoping that giving corporations a break now will supercharge things enough to make up for it later.
Kinda, yeah. But the report's also careful to say that dynamic scoring, it's not perfect. It's still just a prediction, right? Nobody actually knows for sure if those good things will actually happen or if they'll be big enough to really offset the losses, especially with that $4 trillion hanging over everything.
Right, right. It's like we're placing a bet on the future, but with like really high stakes. So basically what I'm hearing is there's no easy answer when it comes to the TCJA.
Nope, pretty much. There are good arguments on both sides, for sure. I think the main thing this report's saying is we got to look at this from all angles, the good and the bad, and remember that whatever happens is going to take years to really shake out.
No quick fixes, huh? Okay, so we've talked numbers, we've talked maybes,
Right.
but at the end of the day, this is about people, right? Like what we owe to each other, even people who aren't born yet.
100%. And this report actually uses the phrase intergenerational equity, which is a fancy way of saying, are we being fair to the people who come after us?
It's like, are we saying, hey, things are good now, so we're good? Even if it means, like, they're worse off later. Tough question.
Yeah, and the report doesn't try to answer it for us, but it does make it clear that we need to be thinking about this, about the future, when we make decisions about taxes, about spending, about, well, anything that's going to have long-term effects.
Reminds me of that saying, we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. Kind of fits, right?
Totally. Like, this isn't just about, numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about what are our values? What do we actually care about?
So all this is super interesting, but like, what's the takeaway for, regular people listening? What should they do, even if they're not like econ experts?
I think the biggest thing is don't just believe everything you hear. Like, when politicians start talking about tax cuts, don't just think about your next paycheck. Think bigger.
Okay, so like what should we be asking instead?
Ask about those long-term costs, about who's actually going to benefit, who might end up paying for it all down the line. Think about those ripple effects we talked about. It's never as simple as they make it sound.
Don't just take their word for it, right? Do your own research, be skeptical, especially of anyone saying they've got all the answers. Like we've seen with this report, it's complicated, and even the experts don't know everything for sure.
Exactly. And one other thing, remember, this is just one report, one way of looking at things. There are always different opinions in economics, different ways to interpret the data.
So don't be afraid to look at it from different angles, challenge what you're hearing, form your own opinion. Don't just take this one as, like, the final word.
Right on. Have those conversations, even if they're tough. Weigh the good against the bad. And then go out and support the policies you think make sense, the ones that are fair to everyone, not just us right now, but, the future too.
Love it. Well, this has been a lot to process, that's for sure. Trillions of dollars, long-term projections, even like philosophical stuff about fairness to future generations. It's clear the choices we make now about taxes, about spending, they have a huge impact down the line. It really makes you wonder, what would it take to build an economy that works for everyone, not just now, but for like generations to come? That's something I'll definitely be thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been real.